So you want to learn how to read a crowd. This is John Young with the Disc Jockey News and Disc Jockey News TV. Today we're going to be talking on our Tuesday tip about how to read a crowd. Now, reading a crowd at an event, if you're in a club where you have basically one music format, you don't worry about that. This is for the guys who are out there doing mobile events where you might be doing a wedding or you're doing an anniversary and you have a variety of different age groups, or even if you have a different age group from night to night, depending upon what you're doing, this is going to help you. If you're just doing, I get the same, I'm at a club and we play, we're aimed at this demographic, this isn't for you. But keep this, because you never know. Someday you may be fired from there and you need this information. We're going to be looking at age groups and their demographics a little bit and talking about that. And we're going to be going basically in like 10-year segments. And I want to start, this is going to be a 3-part video. We're going to be doing the older generations right now. We're basically going to look at people from the age of 55 on up. There's some questions though, no matter which age group you're looking at. The things you need to know or you need to think about when you look out and you figure out, okay, these people are about this age. First thing you need to know is how old they are and what were the years in which they were in that formative stage where they were listening to the music that mom and dad listened to. What would their parents have been listening to while they were growing up, say from, let's say, 8 to about 15. That's the stuff they would know, and that's what they grew up with, because you know what, we can remember the songs we grew up with. So first thing is, what were they listening to as they were growing up? Number 2 is, what were they getting into? What was hot while they were teenagers, from let's say about 14, 15 up to the age of 20? What was hot during that time? Because that they should be into, and depending upon the region of the country, it could vary of what was hot for them. They may be in an area that was country was very hot. It might be in an area where the rock and roll was hot. It might be in an area where more of the crooner, whatever. So what was hot during their teen years? Then the third part is their kind of young adult years. Most people will still be into pop culture, pop music from their 20s or early 20s to maybe about 35. Then it changes. So you got to be thinking about that. If they are getting that time frame, it's like, well, they are about this age, but when they were about 22, this song hit and it was huge. That's probably a good song to play, that if it works as a dance floor thing. But if it's a song that they were like 50 years old, maybe it wouldn't work quite as well. So these are the 3 things. What were the years in which they were, that with mom and dad, what was hot during their teen years, and what was hot during their young adult years. So let's look at the people who are 75 years and older. 75 years and older would have been born in about 1940-ish, somewhere in that, before 1940. That particular group of people is kind of a unique one. They're not going to dance a ton, but there's going to be some things they dance to. They would have been experienced with the World War. They would have had parents who came through that. That's going to affect how they do things and how they look at things. They're going to be familiar with the big band. They grew up with the big band, the crooners, and such of that. They would have actually gone through in a progression into the birth of rock and roll, and even getting into the early rock and roll, because they're 1970, you back up, that's a birth in about 1940, somewhere in that ballpark. 75 years old, excuse me. You look at that and you take that forward, so they're born in 1940, so they would have been a teen in like 1955. Well, 1956 is when rock and roll just went crazy, so they would have been in those teen years during that, so that would have been something for them. The big thing though is when you got somebody who's 75 plus years old, 75 to 80, they're not going to dance a lot, so you're going to have to pick and choose and make sure you're doing the songs, hitting the hits. You're not going to play 10, 50s, and 60s songs and asking somebody 80 years old to dance to all 10. It's not going to happen. You pick the ones that you know are going to work the best with that age group, because someone who's 70 plus years old is going to give you maybe a couple of slow dances here, maybe a fast dance here, and they'll be bouncing back and forth. A couple of things. They're going to be, at that point in time when they get into their late 30s, they're going to have drifted off from pop culture in many ways, and maybe gone to country music more. So the older people would have an idea of some of the early country music. Some of the old Conway Twitty and things even older than that would have been in their wheelhouse. A lot of them, depending upon where they're at, would have gotten into old-time music. If they're in kind of that part of the country where you have that Northern European influence, you've got that Scandinavia, what have you, you're going to have people who grew up listening to polka and waltzes, because radios didn't really exist, so they would go out for live music. Some areas of the country, live music would have been a big band, swing band. Some areas, like in the upper Midwest, it would have been going out and hearing a concertina type of a band on a weekend. So these people would have experienced that for many years. So if you're looking at an older crowd, those are the types of things you'd want to look for. If we back up now, if we go to the people who are like from, let's say from 60 to 70 years old. 60 to 70 years old, let's back up. If we say 65 years old, you take them back, they would have been about 1950. They'd been born in 1950. So they would have grown up and experienced through mom and dad maybe the birth of rock and roll. But mom and dad might not have been into that. So that might have been their teen years kind of indulgences, because mom and dad might have, oh, this is the devil's music. That was common. So this particular, that people who are in that 60 to 65 years range, somewhere in there, are going to be getting into the rock and roll, and they would have been with that. They would have been into some of the 60s music that was that psychedelic 60s music, but you can't dance to that. So some of it can be used, not a lot of it can. They'd have started to touch into that classic rock that started in the late 60s, early 70s, somewhere in that ballpark. They're going to be somewhere in there. This is going to be a tougher one, because this is they're not quite the age where they're going to do a lot of dancing, but they're going to do some dancing. So you're going to be able to play and do some things for them. Older songs probably better. They're going to be starting to get into the country music. Some parts of the country it would have been just strictly country with this age group. It really varies. So when you get into that, that 60 to 70-year-old, you're going to have to kind of play it by ear. You're not going to be doing a lot for them, but you can definitely do some big hits from that and really appease them. Their young adult years, they're going to be somewhere in that 70s range. They might be able to touch a disco, but probably just because of age and physical, you'd want to stick with the older and slower things. Last one we want to look at is like the people who are about 55 to 65. Let's put them in that age group. 55 to 65 would mean that we go back, and that's going to be people who were born in about from 1950 to 1960. So their teenage years are from about 65 to almost 1980, somewhere in that ballpark. So during their impressionable years, they would have been listening to some of the 60s music now. If their parents would have finally caught on and been into Elvis and different things, they would have started to bring that in, even though much of that was released earlier. He started to catch on with mainstream adults who didn't think it was devil music. That's the part I want to say, because he was very popular right away. But there were many parents who wouldn't get into it. Now the parents by the 60s are starting to embrace Elvis and a lot of those people much more than they were earlier. So you may have more of an influence with that. So those oldies are going to work for that group a little bit. But when you get into those people who are in the 55 to 60, some of those are going to, they saw that, they heard that, and they were through. This is the first group, though, that could be getting into some of the 80s things, because their teenage years goes to about 1980. That means that their young adult years are in the 80s, early 80s. This is the age group that's going to start to appreciate Michael Jackson. This is the age group that will still appreciate Prince. This is the age group that's going to be able to do some of the bubblegum 80s music and appreciate that. Might even be getting into the hard rock, but not so much. The AC/DC and things like that would be, but they're not going to be getting into things like Twisted Sister. That's actually going to be the next group down that are getting into more of that harder edged rock, which at the time, these people, when they came through this time and they would have heard things like Twisted Sister, Quiet Riot and such, they didn't embrace that because it was loud, obnoxious metal. And those people who had their 20s and 30s, when they were between the age of 20 and 30, yeah, the 20s they'd still get into it, but once they hit about 25 to 35, if something was released like a Twisted Sister that was so different than the things that had come before it, they weren't going to embrace it. They were probably going to work away from it because it was an uncomfortable thing. Again, these are all different variables that you have to think about, but we'll get into the others more. But the things I want to leave you with is that when you're looking at a crowd, try to figure out what decades, what time frame would have been that impressionable time frame when they would have been influenced by their parents' music. What time frame would they have been in that teen years where basically pop music, modern music is going to really affect them. And then what time are they going to be coming in with their young adult music and their young adult preferences, where they're starting to really come through and find their own way, let's call it, in that whole world. If this is your first time watching one of our Tuesday tips, you could please go down and click the subscribe. We'd really appreciate that, because we want you to be on our list so that when a Tuesday tip drops or one of our other videos drop, you'll be one of the first ones to know that it is coming out there and it is doing its thing. If you are someone who is really good at reading the older crowd and you've got some tips and tricks and ideas that you have used with the older crowds, please share that in the comment section down below, because there's thoughts and ways that you have worked in older crowd that I haven't covered here. I'm just giving you guys some basic ideas on what to look for and what to be thinking about, but there's just so many ways and so many other things, and you guys have got some songs that you are, we'll refer to those as test songs, and that's another video. But if you've got some of that stuff, please put those in the comments, because the test songs video is one I want to try to do here at the beginning of the year, because there's a lot of those songs out there that we have that are test the different age groups, and there are a lot of DJs who have no idea when I'm saying a test song, what that means. So anyway, put your thoughts, comment section down below. We appreciate you watching. This is John Young with the Disc Jockey News and Disc Jockey News TV with our Tuesday tips on how to read a dance floor.
If I were you, I'd hit the subscribe button before I hit the video. But don't mess things up. Wanna know why? Because I'm